So you may have heard that the games industry is going through kind of a difficult period right now. In this video, we'll be getting into some of the reasons why. So from one perspective, there's never been a better time to be a gamer. The technology on offer compared to what was available even 20 years ago is staggering. Graphics can be almost photorealistic now, and we have massive open world games that we could have only dreamed of at one point. A massively active market with a ton of options, and a really vibrant indie scene producing cult classics seemingly at a rate of knots. So if things are so great, why is there such a widespread perception that the games industry is struggling? Why are we constantly getting headlines about how bad things are, about how many people are losing their jobs, and a pervading atmosphere of precarity and disillusionment in the development community? Well, let's get into some of the reasons for this. There's a thing online called the Games Industry Layoff Tracker, which shows that over 10,000 people lost their jobs in the games industry in 2023. 2024 only took 6 months to surpass that number, meaning that over 20,000 people have lost their jobs in just 18 months. Now, I don't know what you do for a living, but if 20,000 people in your industry lost their jobs in 18 months, an average of about 1,100 a month, doing exactly the same thing you do for work, I think you'd have the impression that your sector was struggling too, and that your job was no longer so secure. This turbulent time in the industry is the result of several factors, some of the most significant of which spring from the COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath. With everyone being stuck indoors or on furlough from work, the pandemic brought a significant spike to the game industry's revenue because of a large uptick in people playing video games. Around 0.2 billion more people than normal were playing video games during the pandemic. This led to a sizable increase in corporate investment in the games industry, with billion-dollar investors seeking to capitalise on its sudden growth. Between 2020 and 2024, several of the most expensive corporate acquisitions and mergers in the history of the industry occurred, including the largest one by some margin, Microsoft's $75 billion takeover of Activision Blizzard. We'll get more into that later on, but this was just one of several massive takeovers that happened in this time, with corporations trying to seize on the opportunity presented by the sudden, massive growth of the games industry. However, the pandemic surge did not last as investors had hoped it would. They failed to understand that revenue and player engagement would sharply decrease post-pandemic, as the people who would not normally play video games as much went back to not playing them as much. This makes sense when you think about it. Many people had nothing to do during the pandemic and couldn't even work. But once they could again, there was no guarantee they were going to keep playing video games to the level they were during the pandemic. There were entire sectors of the labour market, hospitality especially, that were effectively shut down for prolonged periods of time during the pandemic. That was never going to continue. These developments have seen corporate investors desperately trying to recoup their losses through cost-cutting and restructuring, so their investments would not be in vain. This has led to a large number of studio layoffs in the past 2 years, as well as studio closures, even of prestige studios like Arcane Austin and Tango Gameworks, although Tango has now been saved from closure thanks to being purchased from Microsoft by another publisher. But moves to close down studios like Arcane Austin and Tango have left industry workers with the depressing sense that even successful studios which produce critically acclaimed, commercially successful games were not safe from closure. Which is true. Tango's Hi-Fi Rush sold 3 million copies and was a critical success. Arcane's Prey sold 1.3 million, and the Dishonored series sold 8 million in total, and both were critical successes. But despite all that, the studios that made these games were perceived as successful but not successful enough, and they didn't make enough money. They were therefore shut down by corporate interests so they could funnel the money they would save by closing them into the most profitable avenues in gaming right now, which at the minute are mobile gaming and live service games. Mobile gaming accounted for 49% of the global profit in the gaming market in 2023, with Candy Crush alone making $1 billion in revenue that year. And with live service games, a company can make continuous revenue off the same game for well over 10 years without making any new games. Games like Hi-Fi Rush, Prey and Dishonored, while they're great games, they operate on a one-and-done kind of basis. The game releases and, bar the occasional DLC, extra downloadable content, is in a complete state once it launches. You get the whole story, the whole single-player experience, and once the DLC comes out, maybe a year or so later, that game is finished. It's out there. You can buy it or not, but the developer, beyond kind of maintaining it, is done with adding new content to it, and will eventually move their efforts onto a different project. Live service games, on the other hand, are designed to be released and then keep having content added to them for a long time afterwards. This is how Rockstar was able to make Grand Theft Auto 5 into one of the most profitable games ever. It's because they continually made money off it for 10 years. They added an online mode where players could compete against each other, added different modes to that online space, including shooting matches, car racing, story missions, heists, and so on, added the ability to buy the game's currency using real money, updated it with a new version to play on next-gen consoles, and basically kept players coming back to the same game over and over again and spending money on it for an entire decade, without having to release a new game in the series. GTA 6 will likely come out in 2025, a full 12 years after GTA 5. Action RPG games like the Diablo series tend to release games that have a campaign mode where the players can play through the story and level up their character, but then will add on endgame content, more story, and generally add more content to the game over a number of years. The Diablo series has sold 100 million copies, and it's only released 4 proper games in 26 years. There was an 11-year gap between Diablo 3 and 4. There are certain benefits to this, of course. Diablo 3 was by many accounts pretty terrible at launch, but was eventually turned into a good game. And it's economical for developers because they can squeeze more profit out of one game rather than putting in the effort of building a new game from scratch every few years or every couple of years. The crazily successful Fortnite is another good example of a live service game. Fortnite is a battle royale game where you play as one of up to 100 players who all get dropped onto a big island with different locales, terrains, etc., and its last one standing wins. It's the same thing over and over again, the same map over and over again, except every area a new thing or take something away or have massive events that take place in the game which you have to be in the game to be able to see as they happen. The game is free, but you can buy cosmetic stuff, skins, clothes for the characters basically, for real money, which doesn't affect the gameplay at all. Doing this, Fortnite has made $26 billion since 2017 and has had over 125 million players. Live service games also usually come with microtransactions, where you can buy extra game content in a game you already have for real-world money. So we're moving towards a point now where it will be normal that a new AAA game will cost an average of $70. And there will still be shops in the game where you can spend even more real money on weapons, cosmetics, virtual currency and more content to be able to enjoy a game you already own even more. There are several games out there that do microtransactions in the form of loot boxes, where you pay money for something even though you don't know the contents of what you're getting. I'll do an episode in the future about the ethics of microtransactions and loot boxes, but suffice it to say, I'm not in favour of any of this predatory, exploitative nonsense, and nor should you be, as consumers. We should vote with our wallets and not let companies treat us like this. But the sad truth is that game companies work with this kind of predatory model because it works. People buy them. Microtransactions made gaming companies $73 billion in 2023. Of course they're going to keep doing it. But we're in a situation that's been effectively engineered by the corporate influence on the games industry. They've figured out that rather than put money and effort into consistently producing good games on a regular basis, they can just squeeze more and more money out of the same products repeatedly and prey on people with microtransactions for years, with the quality of what's on offer and the consumers suffering as a result. I think essentially one of the reasons the games industry is in such a mess is because there's been far too much consolidation of corporate power in it. meaning that the world's most powerful corporations now own too much of and have far too much power over the games industry, or at least over the AAA games industry. Let's dig into this a bit. Let's look, for instance, at Microsoft's takeovers of Bethesda and Activision Blizzard. Two separate one-time transactions that gave Microsoft ownership of everything Activision Blizzard and Bethesda have. Let's look at what Microsoft now own. And this is on top of all the other stuff they own, have made, or have acquired over the years, which is considerable to say the least. But if you look at only these two things, it's still absolutely crazy from the point of view of one company having too much power in a particular industry. Firstly, they own Bethesda, whose work primarily revolves around the beloved Fallout and Elder Scrolls series, along with the less beloved Starfield, their most recent release, which, although it seems kinda sucked, is still predicted to earn them about $1 billion. Fallout and Elder Scrolls are vastly more popular and profitable, and a new entry in either is an absolute surefire, ironclad guarantee to make a hell of a lot of money. Especially now the excellent Fallout TV series has landed a massive boost to the games and got more people buying and playing the old ones again. Fallout and Elder Scrolls are much less of a gamble than the work of studios like Tango and Arcane, and are guaranteed to be globally successful and make tons of profit, almost regardless of how the games actually turn out. I thought Fallout 4 was a massive climb down in quality from New Vegas when it came to narrative and world building, but 4 is the best-selling, most successful entry in the franchise. Along with Bethesda, Microsoft also own Activision Blizzard and everything which comes with it, which is an insane amount. Microsoft acquired Activision Blizzard for over $70 billion, the most consequential deal in gaming history. A deal which was initially protested by the US government's Federal Trading Commission, and which took a lot of legal wrangling to get done. But wrangle they did, and thanks to this deal, Microsoft now own Call of Duty, Diablo, StarCraft, World of Warcraft, Spyro the Dragon, Crash Bandicoot, Tony Hawk's, Overwatch, and Candy Crush. I don't even think that's an exhaustive list, but even just those franchises are amongst the most successful, profitable, and recognisable in the video gaming industry. Combined, these franchises have sold hundreds of millions of copies and made billions upon billions of dollars. It's an astoundingly powerful connection to add to your roster in one go. Xbox's content and service revenue, also owned by Microsoft, shot up 62% after they acquired Activision Blizzard, entirely because they acquired Activision Blizzard. If you're the Microsoft board and you're looking to maximise profits from the assets you've just gained at any cost, Bethesda and Activision Blizzard's franchises are where you'll direct your money, and mobile and live service games will occupy more of your time than single-player games made by small studios. Ultimately, having a bunch of these small studios not turning a huge profit will impact Microsoft's stock line, which they want to keep rising and rising. Plus, live service games give companies the chance to keep making more and more money off the same title over and over again. So if these corporations trim off all these studios and cut costs wherever possible, like paying these pesky people's wages, the line will be more and more likely to keep going up and up. From the perspective of pure profit, raising stock prices and crushing the competition, Microsoft will be a more efficiently oiled machine if they shut studios like Arcane and Tango, rather than selling them off. To borrow a phrase from an upcoming book about Blizzard called Play Nice by Jason Schreier, a lot of the problems with the gaming industry can be summed up as the story of what happens when the ruthless pursuit of profit meets artistic idealism. I'm sorry to say it, but on that point, I think that's basically it. We live in a capitalist world where the means of production are privately owned and controlled by corporations like Microsoft, where market forces determine economic production and the fate of human society. Video games are now properly part of the capitalist machine, and have been for some time. The games industry commands a large amount of economic power, and capitalist forces have seized on that. Those on the right of the political spectrum will argue that capitalism is a good thing, that it's the best and most efficient system we have for economic exchange, production, and driving human progress. You'll even find passages in Karl Marx about how capitalism is the most efficient form of production that humankind has ever produced. It's in the Communist Manifesto. Even Karl Actual Marx conceded that capitalism has brought about some good to society and is a profoundly effective mode of production. I mean, listen to this passage. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labour? Of course, he didn't stop there, and nor should we. I'm not on the political right by any means, but even I would concede something like what Marx says here. And you could even make the same point specifically about video games. Part of the reason video games have become such a cultural force, such a sophisticated medium, the fact that we have such amazing technology around games and so many good games, is because we've let the markets be open and let companies compete for profit and power. And this competition has forced innovation and progress on a massive scale. In just over 50 years, we've gone from Pong to GTA 6. This competition is often presented as an unalloyed good for society by those that argue for capitalism. But at what cost? Capitalism produces massive inequality, injustice, and gives far too much power to corporations, who in some cases are quite literally ruining the world by destroying the environment. And in its demand for constant growth, capitalism is unsustainable. This is why Microsoft is now doing what it's doing. It isn't content to grow and plateau. It isn't content to accept that the pandemic surge in gaming was a bit of a blip and a setback. It wants to keep growing at all costs. The line has to keep going up and up and up and up. But we will reach a breaking point. You can't grow forever. At some point we'll reach the ceiling or fall off the cliff. We could talk about this all day, and I'd be happy to, believe me. I realise this has been kind of a quick and simplistic portrayal of all this, and we can break all of this down into more complicated arguments and dig deeper on all of it. I know this, so I'll just stick with one point to round this all off. For me, one of the main sticking points in all this business with Microsoft and Activision and Blizzard is that, for all it may have done for society, capitalism is a system in which you can translate money directly into power. If you have enough capital, enough money, or a big enough corporation that provides a big enough service for humanity, you can influence governments, you can influence markets, and shape the fate of humankind, while avoiding tax and getting away largely with whatever you want. This is not a good thing. This is not a fair thing. And this isn't actually an overstatement when it comes to companies like Microsoft. It's one of the most important, most powerful corporations on Earth. I mean, how many homes have a Microsoft computer in them? Mine certainly does. And how much money has Microsoft made from us over the years? And how much tax has it paid globally? Tax which goes directly back into global economies to help their populations, improve their public services, and all that. It's paid a lot, but not as much as it should have, apparently. The IRS has told Microsoft it owes $29 billion in tax between 2004 and 2013, and I think that's just in America. In 2022, an organisation called the Centre for Corporate Tax Accountability and Research, or CICTAR, published a study which said, in many cases, Microsoft has paid zero tax in recent years by moving profits to companies tax domiciled in Bermuda and other well-known tax havens. According to the study, Microsoft Global Finance, an Irish subsidiary with tax resident status in Bermuda, consolidated more than $100 billion in investments, and despite profits of $2.4 billion, paid no tax in 2020. Microsoft Singapore Holdings posted profits of $22.4 billion in 2020, but announced they were only liable for $15 in tax. I mean, it's like they're not even trying. An analyst working for CICTAR said Microsoft boasts profit margins of over 30% to its shareholders. I'll say that again, over 30% profit. For every $100 they make in revenue, $30 is straight profit. Yet in the UK, Australia and New Zealand, according to this report, their filings show returns of 3 to 4%. The report goes on to say, Microsoft starves the public sector of much needed revenues while it makes billions as a government contractor, with contracts at all levels of government and in virtually every country. So again, for all the good they've done the world, they have the power to avoid billions in tax and a huge influence over global government. How much could that money have helped the world? On a smaller scale, though, if a corporation has enough money, they can use that money to expand into, buy more of, and achieve higher dominance in a particular market, which it seems to me is what Microsoft has tried to do, or is trying to do, with gaming. They'll never get a proper monopoly as long as companies like Valve and Nintendo are about, but Microsoft has taken its money and used it to gain power within the industry. Its acquisition of Activision Blizzard is the perfect example of this. Microsoft is worth $3 trillion, which is enough money to give everyone in the world $375. They acquired Activision Blizzard for $70 billion, which is about 2.3% of $3 trillion. So Microsoft throw 2.3% of their worth at something, along with all the legal fees. And once that deal goes through, their power increases by a huge magnitude, basically overnight. Suddenly, they completely control several more of gaming's most recognisable, profitable franchises in one of the most consequential deals in gaming history. Money translated into power. This whole mess is a microcosm of the problems with capitalism. Big corporations will buy up and crush smaller companies all the time, and big companies will follow the law of the market, prioritising growth and profit at the expense of everything else. And this situation is compounded, particularly in the modern era, by the soaring production costs for AAA games, which makes it generally harder to turn a profit. AAA games can cost hundreds of millions of dollars to produce now, so you have to rake in hundreds of millions of dollars just to see some profit. So imagine you're these corporations that own these gaming companies, and you're going to invest $200 million into producing a new AAA game. What are you probably not going to do? Take risks. You can either throw your money at a risky, innovative project that really tries to push boundaries, or you can play it safe and make a game which is basically just another version of a well-established, already saturated genre. A new even bigger and more bloated open-world game. A new live service looter shooter. Live service games are always going to be less risky affairs because there's more chance of making more money off them for longer than one and done single player games. That's why there are so many of them and why there are so many games with live service elements. Because corporate investors don't want to jeopardize their profits, developers are being forced to take less and less creative risks, or work on projects they're not interested in, meaning the talent working there might leave and run off to do something they actually want to do. This is what happened with Arcane Austin's absolutely dreadful game, Redfall. All of which means that we have a AAA market saturated with sequels, remakes, with few original franchises being created by the biggest companies, and which generally feels stagnant, uninspired, and repetitive. And when companies do take risks and stick their neck out on a completely new project for them, it can backfire spectacularly, because even though they're putting out a new IP, a new intellectual property with a new universe of characters and story and so on, the end product can still suffer from the lack of risk-taking and innovation I've been talking about. I mean, just look at Sony's Concord, an alleged $400 million budget, according to a leak from one of its developers, but a poorly made, uninteresting copy of other hero shooters like Overwatch and Apex Legends, which are already kinda dated. The result? Shut down 2 weeks after launch, all copies refunded, having failed to reach 700 concurrent players. It couldn't even get 700 people playing it at the same time. A $400 million waste of money, and one of the biggest failures in modern gaming. It added nothing, innovated nothing, and gave players a product they weren't interested in. Now, there are of course exceptions to the lack of risk-taking that I'm talking about. Rockstar, for instance, spare no expense making their games and refuse to compromise on artistic vision. Just look at Red Dead Redemption 2. I don't think anyone else in the industry could have made something like that. Something so over the top in its commitment to realism and scale, something so singular in its vision and executed so perfectly, and which also cost hundreds of millions to make and market, and which was exceptionally difficult to make. You could say the same about From Software and Elden Ring. You can't really accuse them of not taking risks with that game, but they paid off. Same with Black Myth Wukong. They had a vision of adapting a classic Chinese story that resonated with so many, and they executed it into a brilliantly crafted action game. Also, these games, all single player, none of them live service, and all of them massive critical and commercial successes. It's almost as though people really want games like these. But these exceptions are just that, exceptions. In a saturated, stagnant AAA market, they stand out. On the flip side of this, the indie game scene is doing remarkably well, with a remarkable string of unexpected breakout hits being produced in 2024, and generally offering a thriving, diverse and creative alternative to the AAA sphere. But surely part of the reason for the indie scene's recent success is the struggling state of the AAA industry. And it's not like the indie scene isn't struggling either. It's still a really precarious and volatile space. And studios are getting shut down, and people are losing their jobs. It's just not making headlines. Remember that some of the corporations I've been talking about also buy up indie studios every now and then. The reason the games industry is struggling right now is basically capitalism. Corporations have been allowed to consolidate too much wealth and power there, and so for a significant portion of that sector, what they say goes. This was bolstered even more by increased investment during the pandemic, and this, coupled with the fact that production prices have never been higher, means that we have an industry that's going through a really tough time, with people losing their jobs and studios being closed left and right. It will be interesting to see where this goes in the next few years, but as of right now, things do look pretty bleak for AAA gaming. So this is just a few of the reasons why the games industry is kind of struggling right now. We'll probably return to this kind of thing in a future video, so do like and subscribe if you'd be interested in seeing stuff like that. But thank you so much for joining us for this video, and we'll see you next time.